I got a call the other night from pastors, the biggest pastors, evangelical Christians. They said, we have never seen our religion or any religion so electrified. They say they've never seen anything like it.
It's hard to believe. I'm here almost 3 years. Can you believe how time is flying? Can you believe it? I don't know about me, but you look all much better than you did 3 years ago. You're wealthier. And even with the Me Too movement, we can't say this, but I'll say it anyway, you're better looking. Including the men. Including the men.
I was investigated. Okay, me. In my campaign, I ran, I won. I was investigated. You won't say that, will you?
Joining me on Off Baseline as I return from my podcasting wilderness, Dominique Rémy is an independent filmmaker, host of the Culture podcast From the Bronx with Love, and dear friend of mine. Dominique, thanks for taking the time out of your evening. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
So you made the pitch with Michael Brooks on the Michael Brooks show, and I think Professor Richard Wolff was there as well.
Yes.
And of course, can't forget David Griscom and Matt Lick, but the whole crew. So now for a much smaller audience, so tell us a little bit about the film project that you're calling Canary, and why are you calling it Canary? How did you land at that title?
I just put it up and then threw darts at a couple of titles, and then it landed on Canary. No, I'm kidding.
Perfect. Yeah.
And that's it. We're done with the interview.
That's it. All right. Well, thanks for coming on.
Yeah. All right. I decided to call this film Canary. This project is, I think, going on 3 years now. I really was starting to get interested in reproductive justice around 2016, and reproductive justice is really, really broad, but one of the causes that they have been galvanizing around, like the main organization, which is the Sister Song organization down in Georgia, has been maternity mortality and morbidity. And that was something I was also interested in, and I decided to focus in this film project, a documentary film project about maternity mortality and morbidity rates in the United States. And so the reason why I decided to call it Canary, it's actually when I was workshopping it with one of the researchers who's been in reproductive justice since probably the 90s, like its inception, which, was formalized in 1994. And nursing professor and researcher out in the Bay Area, Monica McLemore, she asked me point blank, I really like how she's very matter of fact.
That's helpful always.
Yeah, it's very helpful for me because I am a writer and I'm quite wordy and I can be very meandering. And she asked me, matter of factly, she said, okay, so what is your angle? Because she told me she has been working on several projects. She consistently gets media requests, and a lot of them have been because she is a nurse, have been really medically based and talking about implicit bias in medicine and medical care. And I knew when I was really getting into reproductive justice and reading the introduction by Loretta Ross and Ricky Solinger, I recommend everyone read it. It's amazing, and it's a pretty easy read. It's not dense theory like people would assume it is.
Yeah, that's helpful and inviting.
Yeah. They did such a remarkable job in like threading, history and like sociology and like broader themes that can lead to, having conditions basically
right.
that increase the risk of mortality and morbidity. And at the moment when I was speaking to her, I was really telling her, like, I have this project in mind, but I didn't really have so much of a language for it. And then we worked on it. And I said, like, I really feel that these deaths are obviously very heartbreaking, but they really do signal something deeper. And, the term canary in the coal mine, or the phrase rather, is how we both feel about these numbers and why it's happening, in the most developed country in the Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Also, I think we're the richest country, and we have rates that are on par with developing countries. And when I was speaking to her, I was like, I really feel like there's something letting us know, like the deaths, we need to work backwards from it. And these deaths serve as the canary in the coal mine. And the investigation with this project is to understand, find the narrative, figure out what are the factors that go into having so many people who give birth die.
Right. So the story behind the numbers, not just the cold numbers themselves, and maybe making commentary on just an observation on those specific numbers and saying, oh, they affect, disproportionately affect mothers, people of color, Black women more disproportionately, and that's the story. But if I understand correctly, you're saying that the canary in the coal mine is the fact that the numbers are just sort of the tip of the iceberg as far as the overall perspective on this. Is that
absolutely right? Yes? Yeah.
So that's that sets off an entire fork in the road as far as directions you can take that in, and so you're factoring in more than just more than just the story. You're talking about historical context. You're talking about socioeconomic context. Tell me a bit more about maybe the socioeconomic and sociological factors that maybe have been on your mind as you're sort of putting this information together, and maybe some realizations that you've had from that.
Yeah, so it's excellent that you say realizations, because this is something that when I was first starting to read the headlines, and I do have what is it? It's like a Google tracker, or I don't know, you can like set up it's Google Alert. So I set up a Google Alert for these kinds of headlines. And face value, you read it, and not like I have any implicit bias, but just by way of
of course not.
Yeah, just by way of being socialized in the United States. And, I have grown up in a particular class, and I didn't come to my own class consciousness until very, very late. There's just like this narrative that like Black and brown folks are overwhelmingly in lower socioeconomic status. And that's something that I was like, oh, okay. In my mind, first initially reading these headlines, I'm like, well, it makes sense that, Black and brown mothers and families don't have access to good care because care is commodified. And they might not have like financial resources to attend to that.
Implicating specifically the healthcare, the privatized healthcare model.
Yeah. And then in my own thought process, I was like, okay, so yeah, like a lot of the places when you look at the high rates, it's, there is rural Georgia, which will be heading down to my production team and I lived in the Bronx for a while, and I'm also going to be working within the Bronx and Brooklyn, because Bronx and Brooklyn also have really high rates in the New York State area. So in my initial understanding, I was like, well, yeah, it kind of makes sense. Poverty and the poverty of care are linked. But when I heard about Serena Williams, or when everyone really heard about Serena Williams, and then also Beyonce, talked very frankly about how they had near fatalities while giving birth, I was like, okay, so that really throws my it's only poor mothers.
Right. Yeah, because they are not.
They are not. And Serena Williams, I always say, is arguably the most fit person, woman or man or who, whatever identity. Actually,
not going to argue with that point now.
Yeah, she's arguably the most fit person, I think, in the United States. And for her to talk about how, trying it was to give birth to her firstborn, I was like, okay, if Serena is having issues, I'm just going to hang it up, call it quits.
That's it.
That's it. Close for business. Not even going to think about it. So that is when I had to do a deeper introspection in race. And I think this is something that, especially on the left, is a huge conversation. It's is it race or is it class or is it a bit of both? And I think with this project, I really want to have that, I guess it's intersectionality. I really want to have...
That's the buzzword, yeah.
Yeah. I really want to have these two things explored, because there is a class issue or a class divide, and within reproductive justice, there is economic justice. That's one of the things that is part of the tenets. And I also want to look at, okay, what is it about Black women, as well as brown women, more specifically Indigenous women, also suffer really, really high rates. And I wanted to understand, what is it that's going on? Because in my mind also, as a Black woman, I know that my body isn't inherently defective. You know what I mean?
Right.
And there is something that is a little... it gets in there, and sometimes it's a little bit more overt, but sometimes when you do read in between the lines or just actual text, there is an implication that the reason why, outside of socioeconomic factors, the reason why, certain communities have disproportionate rates is solely because of them and their bodies and their makeup and their own health. And I was like, wait a minute.
And their very existence, right?
Yeah.
Which is, that's very offsetting just as a concept.
Right. But this is, the society is not new to race science. A lot of it, the ways that oppression of marginalized people has been able to be codified is through eugenics. And more famously, our eugenics program was so renowned and beloved.
Yes, world renowned, right.
World renowned and beloved. It made its way to Germany. So this is something that I also wanted to dig a little deeper. And that's one of the realizations. It's okay, it's not solely socioeconomic, where even I found myself falling into this pattern that people of certain communities are just going to be poorer and just not have better care. And I in my own research is like, oh, wait, I need to question that. Like, why are people in specific communities with poorer care? And why are people in specific communities from different class backgrounds receiving poorer care? And I know it's not because we have like a Black gene that
inherent,
just,
right.
Yeah, that just disadvantages us.
Right, but this is the part of the story where NPR just moves on to the next story, right? And that's kind of all. They leave that hot potato right there, and then they don't address that. So, and then a lot of people that cover this drop that and leave that there. So this is quite a kind of to my mind, it's an intimidating topic because you are dealing with something that's very, the race science stuff is picking up a lot of steam kind of in popular culture, or at least among internet culture. I don't know if I want to say popular culture, but
I feel like NPR and ProPublica actually did a great job, at least in when they were talking about Shalom Irving, who's one of the stories that has been like the first story that I like read, and I was like, I need to go to therapy because it was so sad. Yeah. But so I think they've been great at like giving a really human texture to it. But I think you're right in just, like pointing out that like that there's a lot of think pieces that don't delve entirely deep. I want to shout out Linda Villarosa, who wrote for the New York Magazine. She wrote like a 20-page spread about it, and she did really great research and work on it that really does go into like society, just like living as a Black person, a brown person in society will wear you down to even childbirth and reproduction. But yeah, I think overall though, like you said, in mainstream, it's like kind of there, maybe they use euphemisms. It's not entirely exposed or talked about in a way that we, I think, socially, culturally should be talking about this, because I am coming from a reproductive justice lens, but it doesn't start or even stop at reproductive justice. It is pervasive. This is how we built this society in this country and how we're able to perpetuate, the myth of American exceptionalism, and, how we're able to kind of separate why it is, like have a kind of dissonance as to like why it is groups of people just aren't succeeding. And we don't need to like link the legacy of slavery. We don't need to link the legacy of land dispossession. We don't need to link the legacy of now codifying race with what's happening. It's really just like America happened, kind of crappy things happen along the way, and now we're here.
Oops, and here we are.
And
But it really does kind of, with what we've outlined and kind of the point that we reach in that discussion, it really does beg the question about the intersection of all of these different things, all these different pieces that we observe and we notice are there, but putting them together is kind of the work to take it to that next level. And I'm so sad to say this, or embarrassed, really. But everyone comes to their own education at different times. But I just discovered Howard Zinn. I wouldn't say just, like a year ago. And in the introduction of People's History of the United States, which is a great book. The People's History,
Yeah. I don't have the quote right offhand. But he talks about, the importance of history and not to have really have the history where we talk about really frankly about origins, particularly within settler colonial societies, not to be scandalized or to have a really moral indictment on the society at large, but rather it's important to discuss this because history informs our present. And it's not really, I'm going to be talking with Marie Schwartz, who wrote Birthing a Race and,
cool.
obstetrics in antebellum South. So it's not really I am finger wagging and saying, look at you, white people.
Right. And Howard Zinn does a really good job of setting that boundary for the discussion.
Yeah, I think especially at this time, it's super important to do the hard work. And the hard work is let's be informed. That's the first step.
That is very hard.
Yeah. It's very hard with how we've culturally set things up.
Yeah.
It's really hard to just get informed. Anti-intellectualism did a really great job in the past 40 years.
Oh, hell of a job. Thorough.
Yeah. So undoing all of that and doing the work and not really castigating and saying myself, independent filmmaker, am morally superior to everyone in American society. I obviously operate within American society. And there's a lot of things, like I was saying earlier, I didn't even have a class consciousness. And the reason why I have been able to enjoy many luxuries as a middle class, first generation, daughter of immigrants is because of a lot of the things that, the legacy of building this country afforded us, or even the legacy
built on foundations that are less than desirable.
Exactly. So I am not in a position to even, shine a mirror, shine a light on other people and say this is your doing. It's, hey, take my hand. We're going to do this work together because at the end of the day, lives are at stake.
Right.
Yeah.
And you say that you're on some level not even qualified because of all the advantages that you've been able to utilize. But I'm thinking of with the power comes responsibility kind of thing too. Right. Just
I really like that quote. I know some people
quoting Howard Zinn and Spider-Man, but it goes hand in hand.
We are very well rounded.
But for sure, no, it makes me think of I guess so. One of the more alarming parts for me is if you're not directly affected by some of this information, you just don't hear about it at all a lot of the times. Just as from my perspective, just as a middle class white person in areas of built on foundations where I'm not exposed to a lot of things. I have to go seeking out these rates, and just the very fact that it's alarming to me is that alarming to you that people, if that makes sense, is the alarming thing from your perspective that people from my background are even shocked about this, if they know about it at all.
Yeah. And
sorry, that's kind of a ridiculous question, but it's a kind of a meta reaction question, but that's kind of in the weeds, but it's kind of one of my initial reactions.
Yeah, and I do sometimes struggle with this when I find out something and then I'm like, how did no one know this? Or how did no one inform me? Right. And then I see that other people just don't know it. And I'm like, how do you not know? Like, how do you just not realize?
Yeah, you go from how did I not know to how did you not know?
Yeah. And I think this film actually has been a great exercise in understanding how hegemony works. I think that is what you're kind of talking about is I think part of the hegemonic American cultural project is to foment apathy. And it's like, if it really is not happening directly within your confines, it's something that's out there. Right. And there hasn't been a real galvanizing effort, like, to be even informed in like international politics, like since World War II or maybe even Vietnam more recently. It's just really like, I don't know, a lot of things are encapsulated within either the home or like the community. And, you know, we're really amped up now because we have a presidential election, but that's like the extent of how involved we are nationally as like a community.
Right. And, you know, from how we experience that within our communities is maybe the extent to which we even put some thought into that. But, you know, the concept of hegemony, which, you know, kind of dominance of one sort of perspective or social group over the entire, you know, narrative of even understanding issues. We were dealing with some pretty built-in blind spots.
Yes. And
all over the place.
I think this is the first time I actually revealed my own blind spot. And it came more from a classist perspective. Not that I am like a self-hating Black person who's just like, well, yeah, those poor Blacks are just over there, but more just like, oh, that is how I have been socialized to understand, you know, African-American culture, particularly as a first generation of like Caribbean and Latinx parents. There is, I know like there's a joke in quotes, on Twitter about the diaspora wars, which I think is a thing. It's just like, you know, Africans think they're better than Caribbeans and Caribbeans think they're better than African Americans. And my introduction into American Black culture actually has been molded through television because the neighborhood or my immediate interactions were not American Black culture, but, you know, Haitian, Dominican, and Cuban and immigrant culture. And
if we're talking about television, we're definitely talking about a certain dominant hegemony there.
Exactly. And that, not to do like one-on-one comparison, like, oh, in my mind, I just recall what I saw on television, but that is something that kind of, like you said, it's built in. It's just like something that kind of cues you into understanding other people is media and representation. And that was a blind spot for me when I was reading, you know, why so many Black, Latina, and Indigenous people who give birth were, you know, suffering.
Yeah, exactly. And these are really difficult obstacles to overcome. And so, you know, I want to give you some significant kudos for taking that journey in a you know, on such a massive level of trying to put all this information together. Because that's pretty, you know, overwhelming.
It is.
just give you some permission here to acknowledge that.
Yeah, you know, it really is. And I take it in. I really do appreciate all the support and all the thank yous and, that people have been giving to me and my team. Really, I'm not doing this alone. I have a team, and I am deeply grateful for all their support and the time that they put into this as well. But I have to be honest, it is when when I was talking to Monica, and she's like, "Where's your angle?" I was like, I don't even know. And as I go, we workshopped it, and I'm talking to you now, like I think 8 months later from that initial meeting with Monica, I have honed it down, and even still, in the distillation, it's still rather overwhelming. So when I was on the Michael Brooks show, and I was really intimidated, by the way. Of course. And not to say that I'm not intimidated right now, because I'm with the big leagues.
Right. Yeah. The Michael Brooks show warmed you up for Off Baseline. I know.
Exactly. You get it. Professor Wolf, when he said, he's like, I think that's a remarkable idea. I think I died for a minute.
Like,
there
Wolf
was a radio silence on my
Dr. Wolf gets it.
Yeah. But when he was really great at explaining what my motives, and I was like, listen, even I don't understand my motives. I understand it, but I couldn't articulate it. Yeah. But he was saying that what I'm doing, and this is what I really hope to do with this project, is to take something really broad, break it down, and then build it up again. And that is going to take, that's multidisciplinary. So I mentioned the historical context, and you also talked about that as well, but also economics, which, Dr. Wolf,
lives to
do. But also, I'm very happy that I have David Griscom, who is part of the TMBS universe, to help me navigate with, the economic side of it. Yeah. And then I also have medical, and I do have a media component.
Oh, yeah.
And when you're talking about it, it's it is so overwhelming.
Yeah. You're dipping your toes into all these different professions and philosophies and disciplines.
I also forgot to say this, and I actually meant to message this to you, but I remember a while ago we had a conversation about the book that you were reading, Color of Law, which I snapped up as well. And that is also something I'm like, how do I fit in
law
and real estate and segregation,
redlining,
redlining. And that was, thanks to your suggestion, but these are things that all work within each other to create these conditions.
Yeah. At a certain point, it gets to be dizzying, and you can kind of start to maybe understand why some people, why most people haven't gone down this route that you're taking.
Yeah.
Just from the perspective of, I would say you need a lot of information, and you need a lot of sources, and of course self-care along the way, right?
Yes. Oh my goodness. Yes.
But I you kind of hit towards this, but the objective outcome that you hope for the project, do you just want to make white people feel guilty, Dominique?
Implicitly, yes.
Yes, exactly. So awareness of racial disparity for people, as you've mentioned, to actually have a class awareness of these disparities.
Yeah.
Noticing how one begets the other, how they're interlinked.
Yes.
But what in turn is the result of these awarenesses?
Yeah. So I realize it, like you mentioned, it is a tough subject. And even I was saying, I struggled with this. And I also have realized that there is a certain stronghold that if you are mildly critical of American society that is immediately met with defenses. And I obviously cannot have a product that is just going to be super coddling. You know what I mean?
Right. Well,
so
that would be pretty useless, right?
Right, exactly. So I do realize that there is just going to be a subset of viewers who probably will hate watch it and say, I, want to be like Reverend Richard White and say like death to America, right? But what I do hope is what happens is that, like I said, that, the information won't be comfortable. This isn't comfortable. Death isn't comfortable.
Right.
Racial disparity isn't comfortable. How we become such a racially and economically stratified country isn't comfortable.
Right.
And I want that to be something that the viewers take in and sit in, but not something to be an indictment.
Yeah.
It is, we understand how these all work with one another. How do we then, come together collectively and, change society?
Yeah. Because ultimately we do have to, on some level, come together. Obviously, not everybody is going to work with everybody in this sort of awareness, and not everyone's going to, consume the same information about it in the first place. But you're navigating not just, white fragility or colonial fragility even, or class fragility, but just these are uncomfortable subjects, and can we have a real conversation, put everything on the table, everything that needs to be understood, even if it's unsettling. And I think we have we don't really have a callus, enough of a callus. You need to build a callus on your fingers to play the guitar, just using my own example. And we don't have enough of a callus for navigating difficult subjects, sometimes without feeling indicted, personally indicted.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so this is funny because, I sometimes find myself around, a decent amount of boomers. Don't ask me how.
It happens. It
just happens.
Yeah, it's not easy quite to avoid all boomers.
Exactly.
Right.
So then, and I really don't understand why I do get this conversation or this question, but it's just like, why do millennials feel really entitled? And then they answer it for me, and they're like, well, when you think you're the best and you've been told you're the best. And I'm like, I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant's daughter. I was told to work for an A+ when I got an A. I did not have that same experience that you're projecting onto me.
Right.
But that's another episode. I'll call in for that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Sounds good. I'll create a call-in opportunity for that.
Yeah. A therapy session is growing up as a
that's what I was talking about.
Yeah. But I think, though, it's when I think of it in a larger scale, it's like, well, when you're told you're the best country and you grew so rapidly because of primitive accumulation of capital by way of slavery and land dispossession, and you're consistently performing on a world stage as quote unquote the best, and a lot of cultural markers are set by your own standards, and a lot of wars have been fought in the name of nation building because we're the best, we're the exemplar democracy. So when culturally, I think cognitively, am I saying it right? Am I using the right word? Like the cultural consciousness.
So
Cognitively
too would work in how you used it, but yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. We're learning and talking.
I feel like the word cognitive is like I have enough familiarity to try to identify where I can use it. And it's basically just wherever.
Yeah.
Wherever your thoughts are, that's where cognitive applies.
Yeah. So I think when the cultural or like the national consciousness is like, we're the best, and you hear maybe like, probably not in this area, then that's going to hurt.
Yeah. It's there's some ego and there's some identity in that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I want to be as, respectful and honest and truthful to, the content. And I have an amazing array of, talking heads who have agreed to be part of this project, and they are highly credentialed and have written extensively on their areas of expertise, and I really want to provide that. So I really want to provide information. I really I want to be an educator in this aspect of the film, but I also have been in talks with several people who I would like to follow as subjects. And the three areas that, have come up in my research and that have been really something that has piqued my interest in terms of narrative have been birth work, which is like midwifery, and people who serve as doulas, people who are actually, incubating children, and then also reproductive justice activists. So in addition to having interviews that will give you context, I also want to follow people who, like you and I, we live within the system, but people who are really doing the work, either as a doula, midwife, or an activist, or, just people who are pregnant and have to live in this society. So that is going to be cut in between all of the interviews. So that is how the film is shaping up.
And that adds richness to the following along with the 30,000 foot perspective, right? I mean, it makes it real.
Yes, exactly. And I think earlier, before, I was saying, I meandered, but I think you did ask me kind of I guess, solutions or what.
Yeah. Just kind of objective outcomes, what are the awarenesses and that you hope to come out of that, and what do you hope those awarenesses lead to?
Yeah. So one thing that personally has been grinding my gears is the fact that we do not have family leave. We don't have paternal leave or maternal leave, as a country. It's really left up to the goodwill of your employer.
The mercy, right?
Yeah. And I think that's really violent. To be honest.
It's a very threatening prospect.
Yeah. And a lot of mortalities and complications happen in the 6 weeks after 3 to 6 weeks after giving birth. I believe it was 4 days after Beyonce gave birth, and then she was still having complications. It's not always the child pops out and boom, you're dead. Right. You know what I mean? Right. Or you're having a stroke or you're hemorrhaging. It's not always as that instant. People. Yeah, it's not instant. And that is something I really want to make it known, is that it takes so much to have a child. You are a father. You know this. Whether or not, we talk heavily about, the racial disparities, but it is traumatic on every single body. white, Black, Indigenous, Asian. It's just the material conditions happen to affect certain demographics more, which makes the trauma even more heightened.
Yeah.
So I really don't want it out there as well that like, I don't care about white women who give birth.
Yeah, and just if I may, just you did reference. I mean, I remember just when my son was born and he had complications. He had his the umbilical cord was wrapped around his neck as he came out, and he wasn't crying or breathing, and so they had to rush him off and everything. And so after the initial rush sort of died down a little bit, and they have him, it's kind of connected to all these things that help him breathe. I'm starting to have realizations and thoughts about how much time off can I afford to take in this job, because I was fairly new in my job at the time, and there was nothing kind of built in. I had to actually take, because he wound up being in the hospital for over a week, and I had to, I had in my mind I would take a certain amount of days off to just be at home and acclimate, to fatherhood and the being a family together and everything. But we actually I had to take extra days of unpaid time off, just to stay in the hospital the whole time until they, could discharge him. So the absence of any kind of paid family leave, whether it's maternal or paternal, is that's a class issue that transcends race in a lot of ways, and it also implicates it in other ways.
Yeah. That is one of the things that I'm hoping is a realization, like you say, that, one of the more immediate things that we could do as a nation is fight for family leave. Yeah. And it's incredibly basic. It is like it exists
elsewhere.
It exists elsewhere. There is precedent, and it's like kind of nonsensical that like we've commodified so many things that should just be, no brainer for like, it doesn't need to be commodified. You know what I mean? And when you say it implicates race and class in certain ways, like there are, again, Black and brown mothers who are probably single or struggling, and don't work at like jobs that, that's probably even hourly. So like they don't even provide any kind of like safeguards or like any kind of insurance or whatsoever.
Or you get fired if you're not there.
Exactly. So like, what if you had complications and you've already just like, you set it out that you were being able to be covered for a week and you needed another week. Now you feel really compelled to then go back to work because one, you have a newborn on your hand and you cannot afford to be fired. So these are things that I want to be like, it's not even going to be implicit. I want that to be extremely explicit. Extremely explicit that there are ways to like in the immediate assist with reducing rates of death and complications. And I also mentioned birth work, like doulas and midwives. And I know that gets a little like, some people, I mean, a little bit more now, people have been, more open to it. But I know that like in the past 10 years, it's been like, oh, what? You don't trust Western medicine?
What's wrong with you? Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to show that like in conjunction to like going to the hospital, it's really important to have someone who's on your team and who is knowledgeable, because you're not going to have an on-call doctor. Like your doctor will be on call when it's time to deliver, but you're not going to have someone who's as knowledgeable about the birthing process with you in a like doctor capacity or even nurse capacity along through the journey. And that's kind of where doulas and midwives come in. And they, especially doulas who are like advocates for you and can go with you to your screenings. And oh my God, I'm sounding like a single childless person. What is it called? It's not screenings. I know, appointments. There we go.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're in the correct category. So, yeah. I mean, honestly, I can't even speak that much accurately to it either, but it was all a blur to me.
Yeah. But you do have someone there with you, particularly if you don't even have a partner, or like you're about to give birth in a multi-generational situation where it's like your mother or like your family and your grandmother who's going to be helping you raise a child. So you have someone who's with you throughout the entire process.
Yeah, and I even just think, and that's so crucial to have, because and there's levels of fortune that come with even having both parents present, for example, or like you said, I had the opportunity to plan to take a week off. That's not something that's widely available, but with all of these distractions, and if there's complications, you might be forgetting things like there was an error with this is more personalizing from me, but there was health insurance issues that I did not have really the awareness and capacity to resolve, that led to the very possibility of a $40,000 bill at the end of everything after all the complications. And various levels of basically lucking out prevented me from going medically, bankrupt from a medical bill from that. But there's so many different areas that can affect this process, and that's why this whole undertaking of understanding this and talking about it and understanding that certain issues like healthcare policy, like medical or family leave policy. These are all directly interrelated. Yeah,
and I would also I printed out. This is like, I'm gonna give you like a behind the scenes like real book what it's like to be an independent filmmaker. But I printed out the entire Universal Healthcare Medicare for All bill by Bernie Sanders.
we are going to read it straight through for the rest of the podcast.
Yes. But so part of my research is going through that because, there is a medical component. I didn't really talk so much about implicit bias because there's just so much.
Because there's too many biases.
There's too many biases. But I do think, when we talk about family, like I really want to hammer home the message that it's structural, you know what I mean? And it takes undoing it and replacing the structure with something universal. And that would be less of a burden on the individual.
Right.
But within the structure, to be like, we live in a society. Who makes up a society? It is us. And I think it's like very from the ground up, we need to demand things like family leave. And I personally, I know that New York has, the New York City Health Department does have free doula services as well as like free nursing aftercare. And I'm like, why is that only for one part of the city? It needs to be expansive. That should be something that should be explored as part of like a universal program, as part of a universal medical healthcare program. You know what I mean?
No, that's pretty special, in the context of all the other resources that are available in different cities. I mean, that's pretty awesome that New York has that, but also, as you get acclimate to that reality, then horrifying that other communities don't.
Yeah. And, decommodifying medicine in general, you're telling me about a $40,000 bill, and my mind is like, oh my God, that's a student loan. Like your child is
right. That would literally have doubled my student loan debt.
Yeah. Your child already has like a student loan debt amount.
Right. Just built in. Right.
Yeah. And, things like that.
Yeah.
These are things that I really hope to convey, is that it's not doom and gloom. I know we talk about deaths, and we talk about the numbers, and we talk about the racial disparities, and me myself, I'm looking at these numbers, and I'm looking at the women, and I'm looking at my face, and I'm like, I am these women, and I am of childbearing age. So I, even myself, I'm like, I see these and I am a little panicky. Thank God for therapy. But also, it really isn't doom and gloom. We have so much power to undo, the sins of our past.
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets to the hopeful message, the broader, the forward-looking perspective in all of this. It's not, and kind of the Howard Zinn perspective. We're not doing this to drag us down, but to equip us to, solve problems.
Yeah.
And that's huge. So before we can continue, I'd love to. Where can people learn about this project, and how can people support it?
Yeah, so I am in the process of, getting a domain and everything, a place where I can house everything. And I have my research assistants and a couple of writers on board to have actual written pieces and smaller projects that's tied into the film, because we were just talking, there's just so much, and I really don't want anything to fall by the wayside, to be honest. And it will tie into the film, and I want it to not just be a standalone film. I want it to be a conversation. I really want it to be something that is going to be galvanizing people and moving people in the right direction. Because, we have experts and we have studies and things like that, where we want to really share that. And, there's been studies in smaller scales that have, been, shown to there's ways to improve the outcome of this. And, even though it is on a smaller scale, listen, we had the Moynihan report, which is very flawed.
Yeah, no, we can
dictate,
be honest about what we have. Yeah.
Yeah. Dictate 25 years of policy. So a small scale study about birth work in Louisiana is absolutely going to hold up in my perspective. But
right.
Yeah, so I'm in the works of doing that, but you can absolutely follow me on Twitter at Canary Filemaker. And we are right now looking for seed funding. We've gathered a really good amount, within the first 2 weeks, which is so amazing, and it was so encouraging. But it is a bit steep. 25,000 is pretty bare bones when you think of it in terms of production. But
yeah, well, so Michael Brooks brought this up when he had you on of making the point. 25 grand seems like, we're talking about all these large sums of money, but in the world of filmmaking, that's a pretty modest estimate. While at the same time you're trying to do things like pay everyone involved working with the project fairly.
Right. Yeah.
Doing all this research for class consciousness without paying people doing the research.
I was just going to say that. I was like, I cannot talk about economic exploitation and then in turn exploit my own crew.
Via economic exploitation, right.
Exactly. There's a great deal of travel that will be happening because this is the rates in the United States. And although I am based in New York, Georgia is the epicenter of a lot of the activist movement and work. And also Georgia has among the highest rates, and it also passed really draconian abortion laws, and they're not to be separated, that you'll find out in the film.
There's a teaser.
Yeah, and we also are in talks with the Cherokee Nation to also fly out there. So yeah, there's like a lot of moving parts, but the best way to support the film right now is to check out my GoFundMe, which I am constantly tweeting out. It's in my link in the bio, and I know Nate will take care of me and put it in.
There will be links in the show notes, definitely.
Yes.
I know it's GoFundMe.com/F/maternal-mortality-documentary-film-fund. But yeah, there will be links so you can find that. So you if you didn't memorize that, and you know, how dare you not memorize that?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, so at Canary Filemaker.
Yes.
And so that's how you find Dominique on Twitter too, and you know, you've got links in your bio for the film and for your podcast, From the Bronx with Love.
Absolutely, yes. We did take a bit of a hiatus because I'm working on a film, but we will be coming back, and I did talk about the film a little bit more on the podcast.
Yeah, we're not going to judge around these parts about taking hiatuses from your podcast.
That's true.
Extremely, you know, that's a double-edged sword.
Right.
But yeah, so I want to be respectful of your time and just kind of, you know, just kind of one last sort of question here. And I know your time zone is an hour ahead of mine, so you're probably, you know, exhausted from this very exhausting conversation about an exhausting topic.
Yeah.
But you know, in a lot of ways, it's pretty, you know, there's energy in it too. It's very energizing to acquire some of this knowledge too. So I would encourage everyone to go check that out. But just real quick, what are some ways that you're, I mean, we're under constant assault, obviously, of the news and subsequent existential dread and everything. So what are some ways that you're dealing with everything? How do you decompress after not even the daily stuff, but even some of the research you do as well?
Yeah. So I mentioned a couple of times that I am in therapy, which has been incredibly helpful. I also have an amazing group of friends who just let me just whatever the time is, I'm just like, I am going crazy. Let me tell you about it. And that's really great to have friends who are there to just listen to me vent. I have actually recently been taking up journaling, and I will say I don't like it. And the reason why I don't like it is because I know it's very uncomfortable for me to write so intimately. I'm more of a person, you know, even in being an independent filmmaker, I like to tell other people's stories.
Right. The audience is a big factor.
Yeah, and I hate writing very honestly about how I feel, and it turns into just me complaining on page.
I mean, and it's hard. It's hard to write, to be fully honest in your writing. I mean, I talk with clients in therapy all the time, and journaling can be a really helpful tool, but not everyone can do it. Yeah.
It was great, though. I slept really well after I journaled, so I think there is merit to it.
There you go. Some objective scientific fact.
Yes. So I have been expressing a lot, letting a lot out, and really sleeping a lot.
Sleep is also important.
Sleep is very important. And I wouldn't say I've been sleeping a lot more because I've been cutting down on my caffeine. I am someone who is incredibly anxious. And I think with this project, it kind of heightens anxiety.
Yeah.
And I did find that my body was having adverse reactions to caffeine. So I've been cutting out caffeine and just sleeping and napping and really luxuriating in rest.
Yeah. I mean, taking care of yourself. And you're doing a wonderful job, Dominique, of outlining basically a lot of the prescriptive portion of sort of from the therapeutic perspective of what I might recommend people do initially to take care of themselves, build a support system, journal or express yourself in some way, do things like sleep, reducing your caffeine intake, all of those things have a substantial impact on your mental health. So that's huge. And I mean, you're spot on with a lot of that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, your coping is phenomenal.
That's awesome to hear, because sometimes in the moment when I do feel like I'm spiraling, I'm like, I'm such a mess.
Right.
I'm just such a mess. And it's very hard for me to like compliment myself or like at least like acknowledge that I'm actually in the right direction, particularly when I feel like I'm not in the right direction. And I know this is something also I struggle with, is like, if I'm not always even keeled and I lose my shit for whatever reason, then I'm like, I failed. And that's not true. I'm just being human. Right. And it doesn't take into account the larger ways in which I am coping and doing right by myself.
Right. I mean, it's in the space that, especially that you're occupying with all the work you're doing. And sometimes just for a lot of people, it's hard to make the distinction that it's not necessarily, you said, I'm a mess. I mean, it's not necessarily that you're specifically a mess in so much as society is a mess. And awareness of that is overwhelming and very normal to be overwhelmed by that.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's what motivates us to aspire towards change. In all avenues. So awesome. Well, that was awesome. I appreciate your candidness and everything. And appreciate the work that you're doing too. I know it's a hugely important work, and it's going to have a pretty substantial impact, I think. Maybe even ways that you're not that are hard to be aware of right now. But thanks so much for doing that. And thanks so much for coming on to my podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Everyone check out, for one, again, From the Bronx with Love, which is Dominique's podcast. I believe it's at, and then FTBWL. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh. You really did your homework.
Well, I tried to take notes, a handful of notes, and then, and then check out at Canary Filemaker, and then she'll have a link to her GoFundMe page. Do give what you can, if you can, because this is extraordinarily important work that Dominique's doing. So, Dominique, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. Have a great night.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye.